Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 46, The History of Costa Rica. So for today's drink of choice, we have Imperial Beer. Imperial Beer is a lager and is one of the most popular beers in the country, having been produced since the 1920s. It's very light, which is a slight citrus flavor. It's very similar to Kona, if you've had that before, and it's probably better in the heat. I think it's a good beer, but it's, in my opinion, nothing special. It advertises on its website about it being a water-positive beer, arguing it is an environmentally positive product. Something that, as we will talk about later on, is very important for the country. Costa Rica is found in Central America, located with the Pacific Ocean to the south and west, Nicaragua to the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the northeast, and Panama to the southeast. Costa Rica is famously a quite tropical country. A decent chunk of the country is jungle with a kind of crazy amount of biodiversity. There are mountains in the center of the country, especially along the border with Panama. These mountains help create a region known as the Central Valley in the center of the country, which is a little bit more temperate. This region is also where a majority of Costa Rica's 5 million people are found. Costa Ricans, like many Latin Americans, are often somewhat mixed with European, indigenous, and African ancestry, although also with many people still defining themselves as solely white, native, or black. The vast majority of people, it seems, are defined as either white or mestizo, with Spaniards, Italians, or other European ethnic groups mixing with the indigenous population. Around 3% are labeled as indigenous, with some of the largest indigenous ethnic groups including the Bribri, the Boruca, and the Move. A little less than 10% are of African ancestry, with many black Costa Ricans tracing their origins to places like Jamaica. Other ethnic groups like Chinese or Arab Costa Ricans are also present, and an increasingly large number of Costa Rica's population is made up of older Americans or Europeans moving into the region after they retire. Language-wise, most people will speak Spanish, with it being the official language, and the language of politics, education, mass media, and just general conversation. Indigenous languages like Bribri are still spoken, but by an increasingly small percent of the population. English, on the other hand, has been growing in popularity, due to Costa Ricans coming into increasing contact with American retirees or English-speaking tourists, and schools often pushing for English to be taught as a second language. Many black Costa Ricans also historically spoke English, or a Creole version of the language. Finally, religion-wise, Christianity is the largest religion. Catholicism is the biggest denomination, with a little less than half of the country being Catholic. Catholicism was historically more dominant, and actually is codified as the official religion of the country, with the state giving a certain amount of prestige to the church. A growing number of Protestant groups are also found in the country, with Pentecostal, Evangelical, Presbyterian, and Anglicans being some of the largest. Overall, something like 20% are Protestant. Other religious groups like Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and traditional folk practitioners, along with smaller Christian groups like Seventh-day Adventist, Mormons, and Jehovah's Witnesses are all also present. Finally, a little over a quarter of the country is irreligious. Costa Rica was first settled by hunter-gatherer peoples 10,000 years ago. Costa Rica, unlike places like Mexico, Bolivia, or Peru, didn't have large pre-Columbian cities, with Costa Rica's dense jungles and mountains preventing large empires or even major city-states from developing. Agriculture and pottery would develop, with confederations being formed among the many indigenous societies of the region. The Northern Pacific region would be the region with the largest indigenous population, with many natives heavily influenced by Mayan society. Around 400,000 indigenous people would live in Costa Rica by 1500. The Spanish quickly started colonizing the area in the early 1500s. Initially, Spanish expeditions thought the area might be rich in gold and named the region Costa Rica, or the Rich Coast. Ironically, Costa Rica would be debatably one of, if not the most backwater of Spain's colonies, with very little mineral riches and with very few Spanish colonists moving into the region. Spain began colonizing the Pacific region and slowly moving south and east towards the Caribbean. Spanish colonialism in places like Mexico or Peru was kickstarted by Spain taking over large indigenous empires, which gave them a good base to impose their rule over the region. However, in Costa Rica, where the population was small and declining as disease ravaged the indigenous population, this base never really developed. The first Spanish settlements would begin to pop up in the mid-16th century. Cartago in the Central Valley would quickly become the main base of Spain's power, although the region was under the control of the colony of Guatemala at the time. Products like cacao and tobacco would become the main drivers of the colony's economy, but the colony remained small. While other Spanish colonies used natives as quasi-serfs/slaves, since there were so few indigenous people in the region, Costa Rica's economic elites never really became that wealthy, at least compared to those elites in Bolivia or Mexico. Instead, smaller-scale farmers were far more common, and more dominant in the Costa Rican economy, and the region was largely forgotten about by Spain. Indigenous people in the south actually managed to remain somewhat independent from Spain and white rule all the way up until the 1800s. Culturally, Spanish rule had a quite important impact on the country. It brought European norms and ideas into the region, with Spanish culture used to lord over and civilize the natives, the growing mestizo community in the colony, and the small number of African slaves that were brought over. But these ideas didn't survive unaltered. Catholicism, for example, was mixed with traditional indigenous beliefs, with a syncretic Christianity becoming quite common. Slaves in the region also had more autonomy compared to slaves in Brazil or the antebellum South, with freed ex-slaves becoming quite common, and Afro-Costa Ricans able to somewhat move up in Costa Rican society. Costa Rica, ultimately compared to many other Spanish colonies, was more independent-minded and largely autonomous despite being a part of the sprawling empire. This sprawling empire wouldn't last, however. As I've talked about before on the show, Bourbon reforms in the late 1700s led to wide-scale changes in colonial administration, which led to anger among many colonial elites. The Napoleonic Wars then weakened Spain, and by the 1810s, rebellion had broken out throughout Latin America. Costa Rica, however, owing to its small size, didn't really see any fighting. Instead, it managed to gain its independence by virtue of Mexico gaining its freedom and deciding Central America was hers for the taking in 1822. The Mexican Empire was run by conservatives, which worked well for Costa Rica's conservative elites, mostly based in Heredia and Cartago, but this left the liberal elites based in San Jose and Alajuela, who wished for an independent republic, upset. Tension grew until April 1823, when the liberals beat the conservatives at the Battle of Ochomogo. The Mexican Empire quickly collapsed after the battle due to tension between elites up north, again giving Costa Rica its freedom. But Costa Rica wouldn't become fully independent just yet. After breaking off from Mexico, 5 Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, would band together and form the new United Provinces of Central America. The United Provinces was a federation with each state given its own federal republic and allowed a certain degree of limited suffrage with rich land-owning men allowed to vote, and Catholicism made the state religion. However, this republic was like the Mexican Empire before it, run by squabbling elites divided between the liberal and conservative camps. Regional instability also broke out between the republics as Guatemala was given a predominant status, leading to the republic to break apart in 1839. Costa Rica and the United Provinces would suffer with elite infighting, but while other provinces were more contested, liberalism quickly became dominant in Costa Rica. While conservatives would at times take control of the presidency, liberal-aligned politicians were more often than not the heads of the country. And from independence from Mexico all the way up until the 1910s, liberalism would hold a tight grip on power. A brief civil war in 1835 would see the conservatives attempt to break liberal power, but they were halted and the liberal stronghold of San Jose was made the capital of Costa Rica. Liberals in the 1820s and 30s would reform the state, making it a lot more powerful, creating the first printing press, privatized a lot of state land and then sold it off to small-scale farmers, and built up the National Guard and police forces. By 1838, Costa Rica, already barely involved in the United Provinces, broke away, finally becoming fully independent. Economically, Costa Rica began a change after independence. Colonial mercantilism was abandoned, and Costa Rica was instead encouraged to integrate into the global trade network. While tobacco and cacao had brought only limited economic success, coffee brought in much more wealth. The privatization of land the liberals carried out helped small farmers get new land and help them grow coffee, and with Costa Rica's good climate for growing coffee, some men became quite rich. A new class of elites, known as cafeleros, or coffee elites, began to spring up. Infrastructure improvements in the 40s and 50s, helped by investments by American, British, and French manufacturers hoping to build a canal in the region that would connect the Atlantic with the Pacific, helped coffee reach global markets and therefore built up the country. Public sanitation and healthcare improved, and this led many in the Central Valley to move out to the rest of the country. Costa Rica's politics in the first decades after independence was ruled by liberalism, but with an underlying layer of hypocrisy around it. While the liberals preached Enlightenment ideas and republicanism, more often than not, who ran the country was decided by military might, with coups being quite common. While slowly more people were given the right to vote, being a landed man still was the basis of being able to vote, which meant the majority of the country wasn't actually deciding who ran the country. Costa Rica's presidents also behaved in a more authoritarian manner, with opposition often being crushed and the power of the legislature being continually undermined. A good example being Juan Rafael Mora Porras, who with his cafalero allies restricted the electorate and allowed the elites to gain more land and power in the country. However, Mora would notably, with an alliance of several other Central American states, drive William Walker, the American mercenary president of Nicaragua, out of the region. Costa Rica in the 1800s was an elitist state dominated by elites, but it still was mostly stable, and the country was able to develop as by the 1880s the military was professionalized, education expanded, and even opened up for women, and the public sector grew. The late 1800s would see major changes in the country. First, politically, Costa Rica became ruled by the Olympians, a group of liberal political and cultural figures who continued to liberalize and secularize the country. Formal political parties began to be formed, although they were still elite-driven groups, and had very little identity besides maybe vaguely pointing at liberalism or conservatism. Perhaps the biggest change would be the foreign investment into the country. Famously, American businessman Minor Keith would help finance and build a railroad connecting the Pacific and Caribbean coast together, and brought bananas into the country, which quickly became a major sector in the economy. Many of the bananas in the country would be under the purview of the American company, the United Fruit Company, which in exchange for extremely generous tax breaks and aid in breaking up any opposition to them, built infrastructure, albeit almost entirely private roads and rail, provided jobs, and set up a quasi-welfare state for those workers who were under them. Many of those who worked building the railroad would also be new immigrants, many Chinese or Italian, but the majority were Afro-Caribbean, largely from Jamaica, Trinidad, or Barbados, greatly changing the racial dynamics of the country and causing racial tension among native Costa Ricans and these new migrants. Other economic ventures like cattle, gold mining, and lumber also grew during these times as American presence in the country increased. But even as Costa Rica's liberal elites reached the height of their power, cracks began to show as the 20th century dawned. Poor working conditions on United Fruit Company plantations led to the first labor unions being formed. These labor unions both bridged gaps between native Costa Ricans and new immigrants, and they started to align themselves with Marxist groups, particularly the Costa Rican Communists, which embraced a much more pragmatic and reformist version of Marxism. Feminist groups also began to prop up, arguing for greater women's rights in both the workplace and politically. Women would flex their political muscle in the late 1910s. In 1917, Federico Tinoco overthrew the presidency, setting up a dictatorship, likely backed by the United Fruit Company. Women proved to be key figures in street protests against his regime in 1919, and after a small invasion by rebels, democracy would be restored. Finally, during this time, a new type of Costa Rican nationalism began to emerge, basing itself on opposition to the United Fruit Company, a foreign entity that clashed with the more traditional coffee economy. While not every Costa Rican politician became a devout Marxist third worldist, many political elites began to question the United States, and economic nationalism and strong government involvement in the economy became in vogue. It is at this point we begin to set the stage for one of, if not the most important event in Costa Rican history, the Costa Rican Civil War, which saw the church and communists, with aid from the far-right Nicaraguan dictator Somoza, fight against the conservative elite, and social democratic reformers, with aid from both anti-democratic forces opposed to US-backed dictatorships in Central America and the US. It's a civil war that makes no sense unless you really dive into the conflict. In 1940, Rafael Elguero Calderón was elected president. As a member of the Cafaleros, he was supported initially by the conservative elite of the country, with strong Catholic support. He was a very devout Catholic, but was also deeply rooted in social Catholicism that believed in a strong welfare state to help the poor. He quickly got to work building up the welfare state, improving healthcare, establishing the University of Costa Rica, and fighting for labor rights. This earned him the support of supporters of social Catholicism within the church and actually among the communists. Well, initially, the communists were one of Calderón's main opponents, with Calderón partially supporting a strong welfare state to weaken the communists. The communists, due to their moderate nature, actually began backing Calderón, seeing him as an ally of the working class. This began to anger the Cafaleros, seeing as Calderón was siding with the people who encouraged unions to form on their properties, thus hurting their profit. The Cafaleros grew even more upset when, in World War II, Calderón joined the Allies and began seizing property of ethnic Germans and Italians, many of whom were part of Cafalero elite families, with accusations that Calderón was mostly taking their property due to corruption and to enrich himself. Calderón, who was elected with elite support, had switched in a few short years into being an enemy of most of the elites and a man of the people. Calderón stepped down in 1944, but he would be succeeded by Teodor Picardo Michalski, an ally who continued his legacy, although his election was mired with claims of voter fraud. The Cafaleros had enough, and opposition against Calderón mounted, with the owner of the Costa Rican daily, Otilo Ilato Blanco, becoming a head figure. Ulata, however, was an elite and without mass appeal. Instead, José Figueres Ferrer would serve as the opposition's popular figure. Figueres was one of those who had their property taken by Calderón's World War II policies, and he actually fled the country, proving to be a rallying cry against Calderón's authoritarian style of government. Notably though, he wasn't completely hostile towards many of Calderón's social and economic policies. He made contact with a group known as the Caribbean Legion, a group of Central American revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the many dictatorships in the region. The Legion began training Figueres supporters, creating the National Liberation Army. In 1948, a presidential election was held which saw Ulate beat Calderón. However, the results were annulled, which led to the National Liberation Army to invade the country from Panama and began pushing towards the capital. Communist militias, not wanting the social progress the past 8 years had brought be overturned, sided with the government. Outside the country, Somoza's Nicaragua backed Calderón, not wanting the Legion to use the country as a staging ground against his regime, while the US backed the National Liberation Army, wanting a democratic Costa Rica and opposing communism in the region. After about a month of fighting and around 2,000 dead, the war would end with the rebels besieging the capital and the communists negotiating a peace with Figueres. The peace deal would lead to the Second Costa Rican Republic, which still exists today. Famously, the Costa Rican army would be abolished. This was half Figueres being an idealist, believing a world without armies could be achieved and an armyless Costa Rica would bring about peace in the country, and half to prevent his opponents using the army to remove him. To the anger of many of the cafaleros who supported the National Liberation Army, Figueres enshrined many of Calderón's social policies in place. The executive was also weakened, while an independent electoral board was strengthened. Figueres was stepped down in 1949 and let Ulate take control, but it was clear that Figueres was a political powerhouse, and in 1953 would handily win the presidency in the first election after the Civil War. Figueres' political vehicle was the National Liberation Army, or PLN. It had a vision similar to Calderón's. It was a social democratic party in a similar vein to the Labour Party of Australia or the Socialist Party of Belgium. However, it also embraced both the social Catholicism of Calderón and a kind of Costa Rican nationalism. This nationalism claimed that Costa Rica's isolation in the colonial days led to a more egalitarian and democratic society, with a national myth springing up around Figueres and those who fought with him in the Civil War. It embraced a strong government and a welfare state, with banks nationalized, taxes increased on the United Fruit Company, the public sector expanded, and Figueres attempting to use government support to prop up the fishing industry and housing market. Socially, a lot of change came under Figueres' rule, with suffrage expanded to both women and black Costa Ricans. Costa Rica was seen as a shining beacon of democracy in Latin America, frequently coming into conflict with many of the dictators of the region. This led to Nicaragua to back a group of Calderón supporters to try and invade the country in 1955, but they were ultimately driven off due to US pressure. While Figueres would oppose US-backed dictators, Costa Rica and the US were ultimately still pretty close, with Figueres and the PLN, as they had driven the communists out of power, sided with the United Fruit Company in a labor dispute in 1955, and allowed the US to use Costa Rica as a military base. I know it just made it sound like the PLN was the sole power post-war, but it actually wasn't, and they lost several presidential elections in 56, 66, and 78. It's just that the PLN was the most powerful party post-war and was able to greatly influence the country. Ulate, while he initially backed Figueres, rifts began to quickly form afterwards, with Ulate opposing the reformist agenda of the PLN. Meanwhile, Calderón supporters and the communists were both driven out of office. Calderón supporters in the 50s began contesting elections again, while the communists actually began contesting in the 70s, but the communists never really returned as a dominant force in the country. Calderonists and the conservatives, forced by the dominance of the PLN, ironically actually started working together, and in 1965 the two formed the UN Party, which in 1983 would turn into the Social Christian Unity Party, or PUSC, representing the mainstream center-right forces in the country. The PUSC was never as dominant as the PLN, but it managed to win several elections, including the 1990, 1998, and 2002 presidential elections. The end of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century saw Costa Rica divided between its two major parties, the PLN and the PUSC. Economically, Costa Rica was transforming during this time. While agriculture continues to be an important economic sector, there have been more attempts to diversify the economy. The government tried to kickstart cement and aluminum production in the 70s. While these industries didn't fully blow up, the country has been diversifying more, and now industries like manufacturing have really started to take off. However, one of the most important industries of Costa Rica these days is tourism. Costa Rica is quite famously a very tropical and beautiful country, and since the 80s, the government has invested a lot into the tourism industry, hoping to promote it, which has been widely successful, bringing in over $1 billion into the country every year. The country has tried to present itself as a very environmentally progressive country, that partially being the reason Imperial Beer brags about being a water-positive beer, with many Costa Rican companies and the government itself trying to increase its standing internationally, and also to continue to draw attention to the environmental beauty of the country. This beauty has also led to an increase of expats into the country, looking to settle in their retirement in a warm, politically stable, and comfortable area. Besides the brief incursion in 1955, Costa Rica hasn't really experienced any major political violence, being one of the most democratic and peaceful countries in the Western Hemisphere, and just the world. That being said, Costa Rican democracy was not without its disappointment. Over time, more and more people became upset with the two-party system that emerged and demanded change. Corruption, rising debt, and austerity in the 80s and 90s all have been fuels for protest movements. Starting in the 2000s, new political movements began forming, serving as alternatives to the major parties, with groups like the Broad Front, a leftist party, and several different right-wing, usually Protestant-dominated Christian parties emerging. However, the largest would be the Citizen Action Party, or PAC, which represents an anti-corruption and center-left alternative to the main parties. In 2014, it managed to win the presidency, breaking the PUSC and PLN streak of governance. They again won in the 2018 election, largely due to their progressive messaging on social issues. However, they started losing support fairly quickly due to their failure to really transform the country and corruption scandals within the party. In 2022, PAC was wiped out, and instead, Rodrigo Chavez, under his party, the Social Democratic Progress Party, or PPSD, was elected. Chavez, before being elected as president, was a technocratic minister of finance from 2019 to 2020. He was elected under the platform of someone who had come from nothing and built himself up, and as someone who was both experienced but would also clean up corruption in the country. While the name of the PPSD might suggest he and the party were center-left, he, since taking office, has been more of a center-right figure, arguing for a liberal economy and leans socially conservative. His more populist rule has seen the presidency frequently come into conflict with traditional political elites and the press in the country. How important or impactful Chavez's rule will be remains to be seen, but what it does tell us is Costa Ricans still are somewhat dissatisfied with the traditional PLN or PUSC. While the PLN did go to the second round of the presidential election and emerged as the largest party in the legislature, over 60% of the country voted for some other party in the legislature besides the PLN or PUSC. Costa Rica overall remains one of the most developed countries in the Americas and in the world. Its political leaders have regularly tried to serve as intermediaries between various rivaling groups in Latin America, although it has also been a historic U.S. ally in the region. This has earned it a reputation of being extremely peaceful and a paradise on Earth. This has all led many people to describe Costa Rica as one of the happiest places on Earth. However, this doesn't mean the country is free of problems. As stated earlier, there is a certain level of political dissatisfaction with the status quo in Costa Rica. Poverty does still exist, and rural indigenous communities tend to be poorer on average. Finally, tourism, while it has brought a lot of wealth into the country, has also created some problems, such as the rising cost of living along the coast or in areas with a lot of tourists, and sex and human trafficking have grown. So why does Costa Rica exist? Costa Rica was created during Spanish colonialism as one of Spain's many colonies in the Americas. However, its isolation led to it having a very different development than its neighbors. Its liberal dominance during the 19th and early 20th century led to a very unique political history that was less tumultuous than its neighbors. Since the Civil War, it has earned a reputation as a pacifist paradise, and while this just isn't true as the country is more complicated than that, it has become a remarkable soft power powerhouse in the region. Up next, we will go to Côte d'Ivoire. Prepare for the French, African nationalism, civil wars in the 2000s, and insisting on people using the French name of the country. So, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I want to give a quick shout out to all my patrons, specifically Danny Brown for the $10 a month, and Finn Tobias. I hope Colorado treats you very, very well, my brother. And up next, I will do Argentine political parties. I'm going to say like a third of the way done with it. I'm guessing it's probably going to take a little bit. Argentine politics isn't really divided between parties, it's more divided between grand coalitions. So finding out what these coalitions believe can be a little bit complicated just because there's so many different factions within a coalition. But that should be hopefully out later in May. And then I will do a kind of special episode talking about what is a country, what makes a country, and kind of those weird political science definitions of what a country, a nation, and a state is. And then I'll do the history of Côte d'Ivoire. But yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I used are Al Jazeera's report, economist Rodrigo Chavez takes office as Costa Rica's new president, Cornica Pan America's video, A Brief Political History of Costa Rica Rica's Law video on Is Costa Rica a Democracy, El Paz article, Rodrigo Chavez, the populist technocrat who is shaking up Costa Rica, Geography Now's video on Costa Rica, Monica A. Rankin's book, The History of Costa Rica, Timeline's documentary on Minor Keith, and finally, Wikipedia.